Okay, are we recording now?
Yes.
Fantastic. Yeah, first of all, thanks everyone for joining. This is Max speaking, and just to let you know, David unfortunately wasn't able to make it today. I believe he's on his way to a conference for the Association for Behavior Analysis. So yeah, very much looking forward to hearing how he gets on there. I believe this is the third in our series, This View of Business webinars. First of all, we were very lucky to have Adam Hansen present his research on innovation with ideas to go. And then recently we had Tamsin Woody Barker sharing with us her research on adaptability and applying principles of biomimicry to business. And today we're very fortunate to have Gareth with us. I believe everyone knows Gareth very well, and he's going to run us through his presentation on optimizing the human to develop the leader. Gareth will be able to share with us what that actually means, and yeah, and then we can get into questions after Gareth's presentation. So without further ado, Gareth, I'll hand it over to you to run through your presentation.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Max, and thanks to everyone for joining. Hello to you all. It's a real pleasure to be here presenting. After Adam and Tamsin's recent amazing presentations, I've definitely got a couple of tough acts to follow. And as we were speaking about just before we started, definitely more visually impressive acts to follow, given how old school, bare bones PowerPoint my presentation is. So I can but do my best and leave you all to be the judges. So today I'm going to speak about how we might begin to understand the roots of one of the most troubling workplace epidemics through the lens of evolutionary theory. Namely, I'm going to use an evolutionary discordance framework to make the case that the poor mental and emotional health that we find among many of today's leaders, and which really are reaching a crisis point in some contexts, that these represent a case of evolutionary mismatch run amok. And although my presentation has some prescriptive and some normative dimensions to it, I'm hesitant to make this a prescriptive or normative presentation on the whole, simply because much of the theory here is so nascent and the connections to modern organizational life are still relatively speculative when it comes to the degree of empirical substance we currently have available to us. That said, I think the conceptual case that I'm going to make today has some real legs to it. And it's my hope that it might represent one small effort among many others to help mobilize some thinking around the ultimate origins of the sorts of individual level workplace malaise that we currently find in modern organizational life. So first, just a little information about me. I'm a doctoral student and only a month or two from becoming a doctoral candidate, yay, in the Department of Organizational Behavior at the Weatherhead School of Management at Case Western Reserve University here in tropical Cleveland, Ohio. Broadly speaking, my research interests lie at the nexus of evolutionary theory, cognitive science, and organizational behavior. And I've really been just sort of long fascinated by the relationship between human biology and cognition and emotion generally, as well as how this relates to leadership and executive development specifically. I'm also the lab manager of the Business School's Coaching Research Lab. This is a joint initiative between scholars and leading organizations to develop a more comprehensive understanding of coaching through empirical research. So we use the latest research from the scholarship of coaching, including some really cool work from organizational neuroscience, and we weave this together with real-life experiences of business leaders in order to inspire coaches and the business practitioners that they coach to pursue their passions, realize their dreams, and contribute compassionately to the establishment of effective coaching relationships within their organizations. I'm also an certified executive coach myself. I've got experience coaching folks from a wide range of professional and vocational backgrounds. And this is actually a part of my role that I really love and am really passionate about. And I feel very fortunate that the opportunity to coach is one that my department provides for its doctoral students. I feel that while formal academic research in organizational behavior and industrial organizational psychology and so forth is going to always be the gold standard. There really is something particularly enlightening about hearing it from the horse's mouth, from the trenches in real time, and particularly when it comes to the realities of just how much stress and pressure many business practitioners are under. And just very briefly to tail this off, I also work as a researcher in the university's Brain, Mind, and Consciousness Lab, which has been instrumental in developing evidence-based coaching practices that draw from neuroimaging science in order to determine the most effective and enduring approaches to coaching and leadership development at the level of the brain. Out of our work in this lab, I'm also currently the lead author on an organizational neuroscience paper, which is currently going through what will hopefully be the last round of iterations prior to formal submission, and which I think has some really interesting implications for this view of business. So watch this space. So that's the short elevator pitch spiel about me and what I currently do. So let's move on to the thrust of my presentation here. So in a room full of evolutionary experts, I needn't belabor a definition of evolutionary mismatch too long. Our good friend Mark Van Vught defined it in a recent Psychology Today piece as, quote, when the environment that organisms are adapted to via a slow process of biological evolution changes so quickly and intensely that it hinders these organisms. Cultural evolution in humans happens much, much faster than biological evolution, and there's a resulting array of discordances which follow. We all know this. What I would propose, however, is that archetypal business environments, to borrow the old trope from This Is Spinal Tap, are evolutionary mismatch turned up to 11. They are about as far removed from an evolutionarily adapted state of nature as humans could possibly inhabit. Now, recently, Professor Van Vught himself remarked to me that things like being involved in a war would probably better fit this definition, given the obvious risks to reproductive fitness involved in such a pursuit. But at least in the developed world, the number of us involved in something like warfare is pretty tiny. And so I would argue that for a far greater number of us, life in the office is the most representative instance of a kind of critical totality of different evolutionary mismatches that have negative, additive, and interactive effects. And in this talk, I don't believe I've even begun to scratch the surface of the full complement of possible mismatches that might be associated with organizational life. But in a few slides, I'll run through some of the main ones. But first, a little context. There are three considerations I would like for you all to hold in view as this talk goes along. First, there's an increasingly large empirical literature that has attested to the fact that as one's seniority and associated level of responsibility increases, so too does one's likelihood of experiencing debilitating stress, depression, and anxiety. Secondly, the effects of emotional contagion, whereby emotional states can be transferred across people, are more severely pronounced in leader-follower relationships. In other words, the mechanism through which the emotions and mood states of other people literally rub off on us is more strongly pronounced when the emotional states are being transferred from a leader to one of their direct reports or anyone else in a less senior position than they themselves. And finally, executive coaching and development practices which emphasize developing emotional competencies are widespread. The notion that leaders have to be emotionally calibrated and fine-tuned people, given the immense pressure and stress that reliably arises in their jobs, this is not new. In fact, the whole enterprise of coaching, and certainly the way it's widely conceived of and practiced today, arose in large part as a consequence of this consideration. So the question then becomes, why does poor emotional health continue to endure for leaders? And it's not like there are a whole mess of unturned stones in this respect. As the scholarship of coaching and leadership development has continued to become refined, the relationship between mental and emotional health and leader performance has become increasingly substantiated. Here at CASE, we place a strong emphasis in leadership development on one's vision and what we call their ideal self, as well as their values. We recognize that to bring out the best in people as leaders, we first need to bring out the best in people as people. And to do this, we coach for intentional development, where traditional coaching approaches, what we have called coaching for compliance, these often focus on identifying and correcting weaknesses. Whereas what our model does is help to identify, individuals to identify and set the course for their development in a process that engages mindfulness and hope and compassion. We start out by bringing out and defining one's leadership vision, and we then use a compassion-oriented approach, which uses a strong sense of interpersonal, almost conversational empathy, which helps to unearth new insights and that motivates and challenges our clients toward aspiring towards their desired outcomes, both for themselves and the organizations that they lead. And there's a teleological dimension to this approach. We recognize that maximizing a leader's potential is squarely contingent on them uncovering their true purpose or calling, not just the ambitions that they have within the narrow context of their organizations, but in terms of their more lofty, far-reaching aspirations, whatever these might be. Because ultimately, these are the things that matter most. When leaders can embrace their true sense of purpose and truly pursue their personal vision, they themselves and their organizations are simply better positioned to thrive. But so the question remains, why does poor emotional health continue to endure for leaders? Well, what I propose and what I really feel is the center of the bullseye here is that while we may be doing our damnedest to develop people as leaders, we are working with leaders that are unoptimized as humans, as members of Homo sapiens sapiens, and all that goes along with being a guild card carrying member of such an outstanding civilization in the natural order. And the logic through which I arrived at this conclusion is as follows. Firstly, the ability to craft and pursue a vision and lead with a sense of purpose is contingent on possessing strong emotional competencies. In other words, leaders need a requisite repertoire of emotional skills and abilities in order to be sufficiently in tune with themselves to develop the kind of vision and muster the sense of purpose that will ultimately drive their leadership aspirations in the most fruitful way possible. Secondly, emotional competencies are contingent on strong emotional health. One simply cannot hope to develop the kinds of skills and abilities I just mentioned without a healthy emotional substrate operating at the level of their individual psychology. You simply cannot be emotionally intelligent without first being emotionally healthy. Thirdly, emotional health is strongly contingent on strong psychophysiological health. There is an intimate, functional relationship between our brains, the rest of our bodies, and our ability to healthily process emotional information. Relative to size, the human brain is the most energy-intensive organ anywhere in the animal kingdom. And when the rest of the body is not firing on all cylinders, the brain will perform at a less than optimal level, and emotional health will suffer as a consequence. And to bring this full circle, I propose that the evolutionary mismatch inherent in modern business life is wreaking havoc with the psychophysiological health and therefore the emotional health and subsequent emotional competencies of potentially all people and organizations, but in the case of leaders, more acutely. And one final thing I would ask you to hold in view before we look at some of the different evolutionary mismatches in question is the notion that we are not just individuals. We are also individuals within a species. Now, especially for this group, this might seem sort of trite or obvious, but I think this observation actually belies a deeper, more important truth. In our clamor to exalt personal and professional development, and to emphasize things like vision and values and the basically unlimited wellspring of potential that individual leaders can draw from. Again, the things that really do matter. We have in the process, or so I would argue, neglected to recognize that we are also human beings. and that because of evolution by natural selection, human beings are closed physical systems that possess all manner of constraints that have been designed into us by Mother Nature. We are not just people with dreams, hopes, ambitions, values, careers, responsibilities, and so forth. We are also humans, sacks of flesh, blood, and bone that obey the laws of physics and biochemistry, and which have certain requirements and restrictions that evolution has dialed into us over the course of our 250 millennia plus history. So, with that highfalutin chip on the table, let's take a look at some of the ways that modern organizational life is negating the optimization of leaders as humans. First up, sedentary behaviors and inactive lifestyles. A recent survey of a range of different industries found that fully 15% of all occupations in the US have been classified as wholly sedentary. In other words, you are sat on your ass all day long, with another 70% only demanding light to medium physical exertion. And in this survey, the requisite level of physical activity required to put one in either of the latter categories was almost laughably low. Basically, many jobs qualified for this category based on people moving between different offices and conference rooms for meetings and so forth. This kind of low-level movement qualified as light to medium physical exertion. Now, this is obviously a very far cry from the overwhelming majority of our ancestral past, for which humans were nomadic, movement-based critters, and for which physical exertion was intimately and functionally connected to basic survival. And a further issue is that the greater one's physical inactivity during daylight hours, the more likely they are to be living a sedentary lifestyle in general. What this means for most people is that despite their best intentions to hit the gym after a 10 to 12-hour day spent mostly sitting down, you can basically file that idea under never gonna happen. For a bunch of different physiological reasons, we need to be physically active to some degree during the day. And the sedentary nature of much modern work, and I would argue particularly work in the leadership realm, interferes with our ability to do that. And a case in point is a study from a few years back that found that just 90 seconds of walking every half hour significantly reduced several inflammatory biomarkers that are associated with optimal mental and emotional health. Next, we have workplace cake culture. This is a term that was originally coined by the Royal College of Surgeons in the UK with respect to dental health, but it's since been co-opted for usage in the domain of mental health as well. Essentially, the term cake culture refers to the prevailing culture within many organizations such that they represent the locus of where most people consume most of their sugar. Now, while so much else of modern dietary patterns can be viewed as problematic, and I certainly don't want to sound like another one of those deeply annoying anti-sugar people, the fact is that sugar is not just an empty calorie, as many people mistakenly conceive of it as. Sugar has unique metabolic and inflammatory properties which have major implications for healthy emotional function. And as it relates to issues of emotion and affect that have some bearing on the workplace, sugar consumption possesses a range of bilateral feedback loop relationships with stress, with fatigue, and with mood. When we're stressed, we tend to reach for glucose-rich food, and excess consumption of these foods wreak havoc with our stress management faculties. Consumption of sugar causes an insulin spike and a resulting crash, and when that crash occurs, what better than to reach for a convenient, hyperpalatable, hypersaccharin snack? And consuming sugar is associated with low latent mood, which, when we're experiencing it, prompts us to reach for something sweet. This is what some people have called the chocolate and sad chick flicks effect. Now, while the debate is going to rage forever about what diet works best for most people, the amount of sugar we consume in the workplace is profoundly at odds with the overall carbohydrate intake that we are likely adapted for. When you're demolishing a Pop-Tart and a glass of OJ before you walk out the door in the morning, gorging on the donuts people left in the break room, the bag of Skittles in your desk, the cake for office birthdays and celebrating meeting sales targets, the muffins and the bagels in the conference room, taking all of that together, you're consuming more sugar in one day than an American of only a couple of centuries ago consumed in a year, and probably what an ancestral hunter-gatherer consumed over the course of a lifetime. This kind of everyday case that I've posited here, this might sound stereotypical, but it's not exactly unrepresentative either. And it's a very far cry from the sugar consumption patterns of our ancestors. And the major implication of all this is that through the mechanism of emotional contagion, again, where emotional states can be transferred to other people and onboarded by them, akin to a sort of disease vector, the negative emotional effects of sugar consumption aren't necessarily borne by the individuals alone, but might be passed on to their colleagues. And given the centrality of positive affect and positive emotionality to effective organizational functioning, this poses a real problem on the face of it. And I actually gave a full-length talk about the relationship between sugar consumption and modern organizational life a few months back at the SEEPS conference in Savannah, Georgia, where I basically sketched out the theoretical landscape in greater depth and essentially made the claim that we are fast approaching a juncture where sugar consumption will be viewed with respect to emotional fitness the way we currently view smoking with respect to cardiorespiratory fitness. So if anyone's interested in some more detail on this topic, let me know, and I'd be happy to take you down the candy-coated rabbit hole with me. Next, we have illumination and thermoregulation. We are stuck in offices all day away from the sun before being shrouded in artificial lighting at night and are all but completely protected from our external climate and spend our days in an artificial Goldilocks climate with central office heating and air conditioning at our beck and call. Obviously, this is nothing like our ancestors experienced. They had to maximize the available sunlight they had, and nightfall would have provided relief from high intensity light frequencies. They also would have had to be adaptable to variations in temperature and would likely have developed requisite psychological mechanisms to cope with these. And evidence has shown that reduced exposure to sunlight and increased exposure to artificial lighting, as well as sustained exposure to non-variable temperature conditions, have been associated with reductions in positive affect and an increase in low latent organizational mood. Next up is stress, what the World Health Organization has dubbed the health epidemic of the 21st century, and which costs US businesses $300 billion per year in reduced productivity and increases in absenteeism and turnover alone. Now, it seems reasonable to speculate that our species evolved under conditions of great stress. As a naked ape on the savannah with predatory and environmental threats looming around every corner, and some amount of stress, what scholars have often dubbed eustress or positive stress, has been shown to be beneficial. Some scholars have actually noted that in affluent environments, the rates of things like depression and anxiety actually go up, and that affluence is actually a stronger predictor of things like depression and anxiety than poverty is. And the thinking behind this may be related to the notion that people in these environments have essentially built themselves through sustained comfort to be overtly psychologically frail. But the kinds of acute, primarily socially induced stresses encountered by most people in organizational life are associated with a range of negative individual and organizational level outcomes. There's reduced productivity, increased turnover and absenteeism, lower employee engagement and morale, lower subscription and buy-in to organizational values, and so forth. And it's often thought that this is simply the result of the faculties for navigating real, tangible, survival-related threats, which served us so well in our ancestral past, that these are being pressed into service in negotiating sort of perceived or inconsequential threats in our modern world. And this may turn on the notion that there is an adaptive difference between the typical stresses that we confront in organizational life, which are primarily drawn from chronic forms of socially induced stress, and what some might call struggle. Indeed, some empirical work has shown that the experience of struggle in achieving work-related goals can actually have positive impacts on a number of key organizational outcomes of interest, particularly in terms of social bonding through collective industriousness and productivity. But the problem is the kinds of jobs that actually have a greater preponderance of this kind of struggle when compared to typical work-related stress seem to be vanishingly rare, unfortunately. And finally, we have sleep. Now, while we can't say with any real certitude what our ancestors' sleeping patterns would have been like, there's a pretty strong non-speculative likelihood that they weren't mentally exhausting themselves from dawn till dusk and treating sleep largely as an inconvenient stopgap that simply bookends the time spent at the coalface. As working hours have progressively increased in most developed economies, there's been a commensurate reduction in not only the duration of sleep, but the actual restfulness and the rejuvenative value of sleep. And what's more, people are more and more often dragging work home with them, burning through emails and deadlines well into the evening, and often not wrapping up until such times they've literally hit the wall and crashed. This means that not only are our actual sleeping hours being affected, but the hours prior to falling asleep, which are so critical for priming the body and brain to maximize the benefits of rest, these are also being significantly affected. And perhaps most noteworthy here is the example of what Forbes once dubbed the sleepless elite, the sort of upper echelons of primarily C-suite executives who really are burning the proverbial candle at both ends in this respect, and contributing markedly to already out of control rates of fatigue, burnout, and depression among these top flight leaders. And what's more, the effects of emotional contagion in the workplace, as I pointed out earlier, these have been demonstrated to be stronger when the locus of transmission is from leaders to subordinates. What this effectively means is that people throughout an organization, not just the leaders, but everyone from the leaders on down, might be paying a tremendous personal emotional cost for the poor sleeping patterns of their superiors. So taken together, this makes for a pretty grim assessment of the state of modern business with respect to just how at odds it is with what we might actually be evolutionarily adapted for in day-to-day life. You might even think of it as a perfect storm of evolutionary mismatch. So, you know, you're sitting at a desk for 8, 10, 12 hours a day, out of the sun, pounding candy bars by the gobful, pathologically obsessing over the stress your co-workers and direct reports have foisted on you without any meaningful sense of struggle attached to your job, before finally returning home to power through a backlog of emails and reports before you finally stumble to bed in a stupor at stupid o'clock in the morning. Again, stereotypical though this may be, it's not unrepresentative of the experience of so many people in the world of business. And it's damn sure nothing like the totality of lifestyle experienced by our ancestors over hundreds of millennia of human history. So this might all be very interesting from an academic point of view, but for practitioners, the question becomes, so what? What can we do about it? Well, I think an important first step might be to simply recognize that current leadership development frameworks might be emphasizing the potential of people while failing to recognize the constraints of humans. We treat leaders as these sort of unlimited reservoirs of potential and growth with a virtually bottomless capacity to absorb stress and pressure and assume an increasingly high workload, while routinely failing to acknowledge that these leaders are also members of a species that needs to operate within certain physiological parameters. I think we also need to begin moving past this long-held notion that things like diet and physical fitness and so forth are merely a private matter with private consequences, that these are concerns for an individual to handle on their own watch. It's rather commonplace to view things like stress, fatigue, variable mood and emotion regulation as sort of simply part of the leadership package, a bitter pill that an aspiring leader has to swallow if an upward career trajectory is their goal. And by adopting this attitude of figure out your personal health on your own time, we have effectively committed ourselves to an unsustainable and unhealthy emphasis on career first. And given what's at stake between remuneration, job security, career progression, and all the other extrinsic motivators that come along for the ride, it's little wonder that something like personal health and well-being, which should be a front and center consideration for all human beings, it's little wonder that this gets thrown on the sacrificial scrap heap in the pursuit of career advancement, and particularly for those in leadership roles or aspiring towards leadership roles. And as the line between life and work has become increasingly blurred, particularly for so many upper-level executives and senior managers, this trend really does show no sign of abating. The analogy that I've often used is that we think that when we walk out the door in the morning, we leave home brain at home, and all of a sudden work brain kicks into gear. We sort of proceed from a background of assumption of, well, eating like crap and not exercising or sleeping or being buried in stress, this is all just my own concern, and I will basically just outthink this by the time I get to the office. Now, intellectually, we all know this couldn't be true, that human brains and human psychology just don't work that way. But because life continues to bleed into work in the way that it does, experientially, we tend to kid ourselves that it can and does work this way. So, prescriptively speaking, I actually don't have a whole lot to offer. With the greatest of respect to my wonderful PhD program, which I enjoy so much, I suspect that if I had a really substantive answer to this question, I would be currently running the most lucrative business consulting practice on the planet. What I would propose is that at the very least, an evolutionary framework might allow us to recognize how much humans, as closed physical systems with constraints, need to be optimized before we can properly develop people and in turn leaders. And the interesting thing is, we already develop policies and practices in organizations based on this recognition all the time, however much this might happen unknowingly. Why is coaching with compassion more effective than coaching for compliance, for example? Why the hell can't leaders thrive on a coaching model based on, achieving quantifiable benchmarks and accountability to company goals and targets? Well, human psychology didn't evolve in a time where these things were a factor. We evolved as an intensely social species for which emotions like compassion helped to assure individuals of their place within the group, and which facilitated strong interpersonal bonding. And think of things like employee wellness initiatives, where many sort of proactive companies have taken it upon themselves to encourage things like good eating habits and renewal and rejuvenation within their organizations. What has sort of fast become the Silicon Valley model for employee development and growth. I mean, why bother? Why can't people just show up to work and get the job done? When you're advancing an initiative like an employee wellness program, you are tacitly alluding to the notion that humans have to be fueled and replenished in a certain way to operate at a certain level of effectiveness. We aren't robots. We actually have fairly constrained physical parameters which reflect the ways in which we evolve. And same goes for every single so-called corporate hack that is being proposed to extract greater productivity from workers and foster more widespread employee well-being. Why are stand-up desks, for example, better for us? Or why should we employ or not employ open plan offices? Why is having a certain amount of plant life in offices good for us? Why should we have blinds up and not blinds down and have water coolers located at certain strategic locations? All of these and more, however unknowingly it may be on the part of most people, are making certain claims about what we are as a species and how we can better optimize that species in the service of the greater organizational good. And for me, evolutionary theory helps us to understand all of this and more in terms of why, and not just that. It helps us to get a handle on how the limitations evolution has imposed on us as a species over hundreds of millennia has significant implications for how we operate in the world of modern business in the present day. Things like employee wellness initiatives and creating organizational cultures centered on coaching with compassion, these are two important vehicles that could be used to bring evolutionary theory into the modern corporation. But really, the specific approach employed is probably less immediately important than simply trying to engender an understanding, particularly to the powers that be in the business world, that it's not just one or two isolated features of modern work life that are at odds with what humans are psychologically and physiologically adapted for, but a whole host of them, many of which are operating together concurrently. If we can broadcast the implications of evolutionary mismatch to this particular audience, we might have a chance of reimagining business in a way that is more in keeping with just who we are as a species. So that's it from me. Thank you so much for your attention. I'd appreciate any questions and comments that you have, and I'll be moving back into the chat room now, so I'll see any questions that have come up. And yeah, thank you so much.
That's brilliant. Thanks a lot for your presentation, Gareth. That was absolutely fascinating. I see, if I'm not mistaken, we don't have any questions on the chat thread. So I'm assuming everyone's mics, people are unmuted, sorry. So does anyone have any questions they would like to ask Gareth following his presentation?
Question. Hey, Mindy.
I guess it would be easier if I just asked the question. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I absolutely can.
Oh boy, that was fantastic.
Oh, thank you so much.
I have so many questions, but I'll just ask one.
Oh.
Well, maybe it'll be a multi-part question. I'm curious if cultural anthropologists are studying this. People who look at our species and the evolution of our species, if other professionals are studying this phenomenon outside of the OB, leadership development, neuroscience space. And I guess the other part of my question is, are there cultures that you think are doing a better job? So I read a lot about the happiness survey that's done every year and the happiest countries in the world, and the Scandinavian countries usually score at the top every year. And I'm just curious if you think that some parts of the earth are doing a better job of this and creating better environments, given our human constraints, where we can learn from them. So those are my questions.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, so to answer the first part of your question, my understanding is there are cultural I couldn't quote them by name or by school, but my understanding is there are cultural anthropologists that are studying this. Whether they're using an explicitly evolutionary framework is a different question. There might be someone else who's actually in the room right now who could answer that, but yeah, I mean, certainly there are cultural anthropologists out there that are studying business through the same lens that we would study, extant hunter-gatherer societies, for example. But I mean, like that. I mean, that's a fascinating project in its own right. I mean, if there's not people already applying an evolutionary framework through a cultural anthropological lens, then that's certainly that really is a paper that needs to be done. So yeah, so I can't really give you as good an answer as I might have hoped on that one. But to answer your second question, yeah, I think there is a spectrum. I think that basically there's not, the closest we probably have to approximating, an ideal adapted state of nature probably comes from extant hunter-gatherer societies. But of course, we in the Western world have, one thing I should probably put on the table here is that, for all the doom and gloom I just talked about, we are and when I say we, you know, the developed world is an unbelievable success story. I mean, you look at how many of us there are now. The average life expectancy is just shot through the roof or whatever. So there's so much about the gains that we have made and you know, in life generally and organizational life specifically, that we wouldn't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. But at the same time, we are sort of engineering ourselves with this level of psychophysiological frailty, which I fear has sort of swung the pendulum too far in the other direction. So I think that I'd probably be speculating a little bit on this front. I know that, I mean, more collectivist developed societies, the Scandinavian countries, you know, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, tend to do far better than the US in quality of life surveys and things like that. So there may be a case to be made that business organizations in those national contexts are doing a better job of approximating you know, a more evolutionarily adapted state than perhaps the US is. But at the same time, I don't think there's a whole heck of a lot of difference. I mean, if you go to the average corporate setting in, say, Sweden, it's not that different to the average corporate setting in America, and I'd imagine there are. Is everyone else still here?
Yeah, Gareth, I can hear you okay. I'm not quite sure what happened there. Can you hear me?
Max, I can hear you just fine.
Okay.
I can hear you. I don't know what happened to Gareth, but I can see the title of this webinar.
Okay, good. Well, as long as you can all hear me, that's the main thing.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I mean, I would, yeah, I'd be hesitant to suggest that any one developed world, you know, national cultural context is any better than the other on this front. You know, I would say that if there are differences, they're differences at the margins, certainly not differences in the mainstream.
So, any other questions? I've got a couple if there's people are still remunerating, but I'll let's see if anyone else has any questions they'd like to ask, Gareth.
Can you hear me? Hi.
Yeah, we can hear you, Martin.
Okay. So yeah, I have a short question. So I mean, I like that. It was a nice summary, and I experienced some of that. Just one kind of remark. I felt it's like largely focused on the individual, maybe a part when you say like psychosocial stress, which comes from interactions. But what I could add to this list is that I noticed that people who are in this environment, they come home and what they do to decompress, they kind of throw themselves on a couch in front of a plasma TV and order some fast food. And so they essentially forego social interaction. That's yeah, what I noticed. I'm here in DC in Washington, and so I feel that some of the social networks are pretty shallow, and there is this talk about loneliness and so on. And yeah, I think it might be related. And just to throw it in, but the question I have is, so what do you make of that finding that people who are higher up in the hierarchy, so that they are leaders, that they usually have a longer life expectancy and like better health? Like there's like a guy in England who has been studying this all the time, and he argues that hierarchy has an effect. And yeah, I was just wondering what your take is on that.
Yeah, sorry, someone else.
No, I just it's Max here. Just there's some good points you made, Martin. I think are you referring to the Whitehall studies in particular?
Oh yeah, it's just yeah. I think that's the one.
Because that was one of my questions for you, Gareth. Is and again these are UK centric studies, right? But the Whitehall studies, I'm sure you're familiar with them. But essentially finding more senior civil servants in the UK not only being less susceptible to disease, but significantly less likely to be susceptible to mortality, essentially, in particular heart attacks. So just seeing how you can reconcile that with the points you made about emotional health.
Okay. Yeah, I would. Oh, sorry, I'm having some issues here with my webcam. Can you still hear me?
Yes, I can hear fine.
They controlled for income or not?
Sorry, Gareth, they kind of cut out again. So do you mind?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I mean, I remember reading a summary of those studies at the time, but I can't recall them in any.
I would imagine if they didn't control for income, that income and access to quality of healthcare would have been huge factors there. I'd be also interested to know if like the lowered incidence of disease among that population included things like Alzheimer's and things like that. But to be honest, I don't have a really good answer to that, apart from the idea that as you go up in seniority within an organization,
you have access to greater income and therefore greater, more disposable income to spend on better healthcare.
Okay, and just to follow on that question, if I may, Martin, and it's a similar point really as well. That it's intertwined, but the key focus of your presentation, you covered across several domains, including exercise, nutrition, thermoregulation. But it's what I found striking is the social domain, right? Which I'm not sure, it's just my leanings from being trained in social psychology, but it's from my experience at least, it's the social side of business and organizations, which is some of the which the evidence suggests is some of the most striking examples of evolutionary mismatches. So I'm just wondering if what are your thoughts really about the social realm, and in particular the point about the Whitehall studies, for example, saying controlling for income. I know Mark alluded to it in his book Mismatch, but also in the book Staying Human in the Organization, discussions about hierarchy and how it's pretty much at odds of our how we spend our evolutionary time. So what are your thoughts really on the social side, and in particular the hierarchy of modern organizations, and if that itself is a example of a mismatch?
Reason that
Sorry, can you guys hear me? Yeah. The only reason I think I left it out of this particular presentation was that I actually adapted this presentation from another one that I gave, where there are actually a lot of other scholars that have sort of covered this topic in depth. So rather than sort of doing a crash course on it, I kind of elected to focus in other areas. But yeah, I mean, the social relational dynamics piece of it is huge, and particularly given the fact that we spend an increasingly small amount of time with kith and kin, the people whose presence in our lives really maximizes our well-being in the social realm, and instead we spend an outsized amount of time with relative strangers and people for whom those interpersonal bonds of trust and cooperation take a much longer time to build up. And you throw social media into the mix, where we are more connected than we've ever been in the history of human civilization, and yet more deeply isolated at the same time. And there's no way on earth this can be good for us in the long run. And I mean, I would just say that throw that into the mix, where you've got severely impaired emotion regulation faculties as the result of poor diet, poor attention to physical fitness, poor sleep, and so forth, and stress. It just makes it even more combustible still.
Thanks, Gareth. Just checking by the way, we have a bit of an echo, so I'm not sure if someone has it on speaker. So if that's the case, if they can either turn down the volume or mute their microphone. Just checking on the chat, I can't see any questions there. So any other questions we have from the group? Anyone else have a burning question for Gareth?
And I would just, I would just very quickly say that any questions you do have, any residual questions, I tend to be more of a writing person than a verbal person. So anything I can, any lingering questions you have, I'd be happy to flesh them out in full over email or in a similar forum.
Hello? Hi.
Hello.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay.
Indeed.
Cool. So very, very good presentation. One question I had that I'd like you to address is about work hours and length of time for full-time job, that sort of thing. Because, I don't know, 30, 40 years ago, there was an assumption that you'd have a 4-day work week instead of a 5-day work week if you worked in an office because productivity was increasing, et cetera, et cetera. So can you talk about that in relation to what you presented today? Hello?
I can hear you, Mel. I don't know
Yeah, same here.
if Gareth has lost his audio.
Okay, that's fine. I mean, if it happens, it happens. I'll mute myself.
Should we give him a couple of moments just to see if he can hear us and if he can reconnect?
Yeah.
Otherwise, we might want to wrap it up and see if anyone wants to email Gareth questions following on from the presentation.
That's a great idea.
Yeah. You guys hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, I am just sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm just having some all manner of problems with my technology at this end. So my apologies. Now, just to answer you, and thank you. That's a really great question. I think the evidence is kind of cashed out that the countries that have dialed back at the level of official policy, countries that have dialed back the length of the full working week from 40 to 35, and I think in Norway it might be 33, 34 hours, something like that. I might have that slightly wrong. These countries have experienced massive gains in productivity as a result of this. That basically, you know, that this notion that it's a 40-hour work week minimum like we find in the American context, and that realistically for your average leader, 50, 60, 70 hours, not only is this not healthy in the way that I've sort of sketched out in my talk today, but it actually results in decreases in productivity. It results in increases in absenteeism, increases in turnover. And I think from an evolutionary point of view, I mean, obviously, you know, our hunter-gatherer ancestors 200,000 years ago, you know, certainly didn't have an 8-hour day. You know, they just had a day. You know, they just basically had whatever was needed to be done to get through that day. Because everything was just so linked to survival, basically, and so directly and intimately linked to survival. I mean, now we live in a world where, you know, the fruits of our labor are so removed, both practically and psychologically, from the work we actually do, that, you know, we are kind of, this whole idea of like presenteeism, that we're kind of at work for the sake of work. We're not sort of at work because it meaningfully contributes to our lives or substantively contributes to the output of our organizations. It really is just, I think, predicated on this myth that longer working hours means greater productivity, and longer working hours means more fulfilled employees. And I suspect that there's something of an overhang from the Protestant work ethic at play here, that we've kind of taken what might have been the more merit-based parts of the Protestant work ethic, and we've sort of disfigured them and transformed them out of all comprehension into this kind of like overwork, hyperwork malaise that we currently find ourselves in. And I hope that I came through loud and clear on that last little spiel.
Yeah, I got you.
Cool.
But that was good. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you. Thank you for the question.
Do we have time for one more question? I appreciate the connectivity issues we're having, Gareth, with your line.
Yeah, and my apologies again to everyone that this has bedeviled us. You know, I'm glad that it didn't bedevil us during the presentation itself, but I'm sorry that it's been a little bit choppy and changey during the Q&A. But yeah, happy to take any remaining questions.
You don't need to apologise. It's as you say, the content-wise, that all came through very clearly with the presentation. So that's the most important thing. I may ask you a question about stress in particular, Gareth. So this idea of different types of stress, occupational stress and workload. Following on from Mel's question about working hours in particular. What's interesting, as you said that there are forms of stress which can actually be good. So do you want to just elaborate a bit more about the physiological implications of stress and these different types of stresses and where they can be good and otherwise cause harm?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess for me, one of the most illuminating things that I've read on this front has been Sebastian Junger's book Tribe, which came out recently, where he was talking about how in situations like the conflict in the former Yugoslavia in the 90s, for example, once the war was over, and I mean, no one wants to go through the experience of war, obviously, but people missed it. People missed the struggle of the war, the fact that it was the struggle that brought them all together. You see it in soldiers that have returned in this country from Iraq. While they don't miss bullets whizzing past their head every 2 seconds, there's something about the interpersonal bonding that arises as the result of collective struggle that really is empowering for our psychology in a way that these kind of more nuisance-y forms of stress that we experience in everyday work life simply can't substitute for. So I think, while not all of us are going to be able to be in occupations where we can achieve quite that level of struggle, I think there's something to be said for attaching a certain level of personal struggle to what you're trying to accomplish, that there's something, that there are personal benefits that can accrue to one psychologically when there is a struggle dimension to what they do. Yeah, I'm not sure how that would cash out in real life and in a lot of modern organizational contexts. Like, we obviously don't want to sort of like artificially shoehorn in struggle where it doesn't naturally, organically emerge. But I guess I just state that the kinds of stress that we experience in everyday life these days couldn't possibly be the kinds of stress that we experienced in our ancestral past. And that to better approximate those kinds of stresses, we need to attach a kind of meaningful struggle to our work.
Fantastic. Thanks for that, Gareth. Love to ask you several questions following on from that, but I appreciate we're out of time.
Yes,
so Ashley, are we happy to wrap things up?
Yep, that's great. So it takes a few hours, and it is evening my time. So I will have this recording sent out by email on Monday. And Gareth, I will be sure to include that if anybody who watches the recording has any questions for you, just to send you over an email.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And thanks to everyone that's tuned in. Thanks for all the great questions. And to everyone for giving me the platform. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Gareth. It's been a pleasure. Also, thanks a lot, Ashley. I'll speak to you all later.
Yep, great. Thanks, everybody. Have a great weekend.
Bye.
Thank you. You too.
Have a great weekend. Bye.
Bye-bye.